Hello, welcome to another Black History Moment, reading from Black Saga. 1700. Population Overview. General population in North American British colonies. The colonial population, numbering about 250,888, continued to grow, but not always steadily. In 1699, the first reported yellow fever epidemic killed about one-sixth of the population in Philadelphia. Between 1655 and 1699, some 4,500 convicts arrived from England. Although cities were growing, even doubling between 1690 and 1700, most colonists lived in small towns and on farms. Virginia and Massachusetts remained the largest colonies, with 58,560 and 55,941 residents, respectively. Blacks in North American British colonies. Blacks in the colonies numbered about 27,817, or about 11% of the total colonial population of about 250,888. They continued to be imported into the colonies in large numbers. In Charleston, South Carolina, the number of blacks had doubled from about 1,000 in 1690. In other cities, the number of blacks grew rapidly as well. Among the colonies, Virginia had the largest number, with 16,390 blacks, or about 59% of all blacks in the colonies. Of the 11,088 blacks added to the colonies between 1690 and 1700, Virginia accounted for 7,045, or almost 64% of the increase. Blacks in New England colonies. About 1,680 blacks lived in the New England colonies, out of a population of approximately 93,000. The port of Boston was the hub of American slave trading. Ships filled with food and other products left Boston for the West Indies, where the goods were traded for rum, which was then shipped to Africa to be traded for slaves. Slaves were transported back to the West Indies, and the ships returned to Boston. Native Americans become slave owners. During the latter part of the 1700s, the Native American peoples of the Southeast, Cherokee, Choctaw, Chickasaw, Creek, and Seminole, became slave owners. The Cherokees held the largest number of slaves. Before their removal to Indian Territory, now Oklahoma, the Cherokees used black slaves on their farms and plantations in Tennessee and Georgia. In the years prior to the Civil War, abolitionists were particularly active among Native American peoples, teaching Christianity and consequently influencing Native Americans to free their slaves. Because of language barriers and sometimes geographical isolation, abolitionists found it difficult to effect change among Native Americans. It is unlikely that we will ever know the number of blacks among Native American tribes, particularly since blacks frequently went into hiding when census takers appeared. Blacks who lived among Native Americans as slaves had much more freedom than those living among white slave owners. In fact, some blacks owned land and several occupied important positions as warriors, political leaders, and even interpreters for the Native Americans in their negotiations with the U.S. government. Former slaves were numerous among the Seminoles and frequently intermarried with them. Native Americans in general viewed ancestry differently than whites. A child born of an Indian mother and a black father might be considered Indian. If the father was Indian and the mother black, the child most likely would be considered half black and half Indian. In contrast, no matter what the relationship of a white and a black, whites considered any offspring to be black, a view still generally held in this country. Pennsylvania imposes differential penalties for slaves. Pennsylvania had relatively few slaves, and prior to 1700, their legal status was uncertain. In this year, however, slaves were distinguished as a separate group, and laws were passed that applied only to them. For example, slaves could not be tried in a regular court, but rather by 2 justices of the peace and 6 freeholders. Slaves could be put to death for murder, burglary, and rape, and whipped for robbing and stealing. Slave trading patterns emerge. A number of trading arrangements, including variations of the triangular trade, emerged in the 1700s. A slave ship would leave Liverpool, England, for the coast of Africa with a cargo of textiles, arms, and other smaller items, which were used to purchase Africans. The ship would then sail to Barbados or Jamaica, where it would dispose of the slaves in exchange for sugar to be sold in England. It was thus possible for the slave ship to make 3 different profits on the original investment. A general rule emerged that successful delivery of 1/3 of the slave cargo was enough to cover the total cost of the expedition and net a 200 to 300% profit. Although the most well-known triangular trade is said to have involved trading rum for Africans, there were many other products traded for slaves, including fish, trinkets, and so on. Sewell denounces slavery. On June 24th, Judge Samuel Sewell of Massachusetts became one of the first public officials to outrightly denounce slavery. On this day, he published a 3-page statement entitled The Selling of Joseph, in which he drew a parallel between slavery and the Old Testament story of Joseph, whose brothers sold him into slavery for 20 pieces of silver. Sewell courageously handed out copies himself. It became the first anti-slavery tract distributed in the colonies. Thank you for listening to this Black History Moment.